Hello, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of COVID-19 Veterinarian's Perspective webinar series. Before we begin, we have some reminders to all the participants. So all participants will be in listen mode only until the end of the presentation. You can send in your questions via the chat box or directly to me, privately to me. The session will be recorded, and should you wish to have a copy, just inform us at the end of the session or again through the chat box. Once again, good evening, everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, fellow veterinarians, welcome to the first episode of this webinar series labeled as COVID-19 Veterinarian's Perspective. This was actually conceptualized and powered by the UP Society of Men and the UP Societas Mulierum. The main objective is to provide fellow veterinarians as well as allied professionals and the industries we touch with relevant information about COVID-19 and how it impacts our professions and how we can effectively adapt to the new normal, so to speak. We have lined up several topics for this series, and at the end of this episode, we will be sharing the list for the next 4 weeks, and hopefully you can also join us then. So for our opening episode, we have invited no other than the Executive Director of the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity. She will tackle the link between biodiversity and the emerging infectious diseases and our critical role as veterinarians to avoid future pandemics by taking into account this inextricable link. I believe Dr. Lim is already with us. By the way, there are over 130 who registered for this webinar, and I guess some of them are having some issues logging in, but it's already 6:05. So without much ado, let's all welcome Dr. Theresa Mundita Sison-Lim with the topic, Hard Lessons of COVID-19, Biodiversity in Crisis. Dr. Lim?
Okay, so good evening, everyone. I thank Societas Mulierum and the Society of Men for having organized this series of presentations, webinars on COVID-19, specifically relating to the veterinary profession. It's also suited not just to the veterinarians, but to the public, to decision makers. Right, so just a backgrounder, I'm sure a lot of you have been reading about this, but it's important just to remind all of you what COVID-19 is. It's an infectious disease caused by a coronavirus. It's very recent. Globally, as of my data here is as of Friday, there is already more than 3.86 million confirmed cases with more than 265,000 deaths. In the ASEAN, we have more than 55,000 confirmed active cases with more than 1,800 deaths. It is already known that most coronaviruses originated from animals. And as of now, the animal source has not yet been determined and continuous research is ongoing. Just to get the fake news out of the way, there are scientists already have given their expert virus is a natural one. The suspect, of course, are bats, and this is a statement from Dr. Anthony Fauci that virus is not artificially or deliberately manipulated, but it came from the natural environment. The photo on the slide, a horseshoe bat. It's not the Chinese horseshoe bat. But horseshoe bats are there. This species is found here in the ASEAN. Because of that linkage with animals, COVID is a known zoonosis. And zoonosis, as you define it, of course, is if the disease transfers from animals to humans. And just some information, facts about zoonosis. 2/3 of known human infectious diseases are zoonotic. 75% of new and emerging diseases are also zoonotic, so transferring from or originating from animals to humans. And more than 70% are associated with wild animals. Some studies even suggest that it's not just 70%, even more than 90% of zoonotic viruses are transmitted from wildlife. And as you already see, as I've already mentioned, bats are a suspect of the original sources of zoonotic diseases. So since I'm linking COVID-19 and other zoonotic diseases with biodiversity, let me define biodiversity. So biodiversity is all living organisms, animals and plants, including terrestrial and aquatic species. But it's not just species that is included in biodiversity. It also refers to genetic diversity and ecosystem diversity. So what is obvious first from COVID is that it's linked to species. I already mentioned that wildlife is a source of zoonotic diseases. Information, however, show that wildlife as a source of human disease is indirect. And domestic animals act as mixing vessels or disease bridges for otherwise latent or dormant pathogens from wildlife reservoir. In the past, as you can see in the graph, and this is from the UNEP report in 2016, that the primary reservoir usually is from wildlife, and then it moves to domestic species, where the species now jumps to humans. However, in the latest pandemics that we have experienced, like the SARS and now COVID, there is increasing studies that link not just the virus to domestic animals, but jumping from wildlife directly to humans. And that has been exhibited, or that has been reported, the recent zoonotic, the respiratory syndrome in 2002. Let me show you some of the species that are linked to some of these zoonotic diseases that we have experienced in the last 2 decades. Avian influenza, it's characterized by respiratory symptoms for humans, difficulty in breathing. Of course, history, usually the patients have been in contact with contaminated poultry. It's transmitted through direct contact, consumption of improperly cooked, contaminated and poultry products. Poultry, source for the human transmission, but the original reservoir traced to migratory birds. And one of the species that has been tested and was positive for related virus is the tufted duck, which is the photo below. Okay. And the contact of when we were trying to control this disease, we were actually, one of the recommendations is really to try to move or to try to separate the poultry farms from the usual watering area or migratory bird areas in the country and in the provinces. So to avoid the cross transmission from the migratory birds to poultry farms and even in backyard farms as well. For Ebola virus, which we also experienced, so I'm going to focus some of the examples on the ones that we've experienced in Southeast Asia. For the Ebola virus is a filovirus. Reston is the one that is found here in Southeast Asia, and in the Philippines. It was reported in the Philippines in the monkey industry, and transmission is through direct contact with body fluids and fomites. It caused fever in humans. Luckily, because the African strains are fatal. The one that we have here, the Reston strain, is not. And of course, the source that the transmission from to humans came from the monkeys, which was in the monkey farm at the time, and then so mostly from the monkeys, and the pigs were found positive as well, but the pigs were asymptomatic, although it did affect the piggery industry. However, the reservoir, the wildlife reservoir, these two are mostly traced back to fruit bats, like the bat here in the right side of your screen, the one eating a banana, the Sinopterus brachiotis. Usually, these are fruit-eating bats, and one of the suspect is that if there are bats that are feeding and near the piggery farms, then there's also a chance of contamination. Although the main suspects are Theropodidae, are bats from the Theropodidae family, like the fruit eaters and the nectar feeders. In a study in the Philippines in 2015, there was insectivorous bat, the one in the photo, which was found also positive of Ebola virus. But the link is not yet clear how insectivorous bat can transmit this to other mammals. Okay. But for fruit eaters, it's easy to deduce that the fruits bats have fed on are exposed. Some domestic animals are exposed to this, and the monkeys there's also a chance or opportunity to be exposed to the fruits that are being eaten by the fruit-eating bats. But the finding on the insect bats is quite interesting, but more studies need to be undertaken to be able to trace how this virus is transmitted or originates from bats and moves to other species. Okay. For monkeys, the Reston has been fatal, and that was a problem that we had in one of the monkey farms in the 90s. And eventually, the concern was that the virus might be transmitted to the wild populations. So the monkeys in that farm had to be euthanized and destroyed. Nipah virus is caused by Nipah virus. The Nipah disease originated from Malaysia. Transmission is through direct contact with body fluids. In this disease, there are signs, respiratory and nervous signs in pigs, and in humans also acute respiratory infection, and could cause encephalitis and death. The original the reservoir in nature is suspected to be again fruit-eating bats. This is a Sinopterus brachiotis, and this is the other one in the cave is Rosetus amplexicaudatus, which are all fruit-eating bats. Okay. Then we go to SARS in 2002 to 2003. Now this has been reported or suspected to be transmitted to humans from civet cats, and there are two species of civet that you can see on your screen. One is the Vivera tagalunga. It's the civet cat, the Asian civet, and below it is the Asian palm civet. Okay, these species are also they're very popular for the most expensive coffee. You know, they feed in the coffee beans, and then the excrement is used for, you know, after they're excreted, the coffee beans are ground, and this is washed, and then eventually you have a very expensive and tasty coffee. So these animals in the wild have, of course, they do have physical distancing. When they are captured for coffee production, then they are kept in cages, and it is not actually the ideal condition for producing good coffee, because the reason why coffee from this species are tasty is because they are the ones who select the best beans in the wild. So they are better off selecting the beans that they feed on, and the communities can collect the stool, and this is actually one of the good livelihood programs for communities. And then these are, of course, this doesn't entail close contact with this species. However, with the coffee production, the mass production of coffee or COVID coffee, there are certain in the businesses that are unsustainable, which collect them from the wild, and this is probably opportunity for contact as well. Original reservoir from nature is also again suspected to be bats, and this is another species of horseshoe bat, Rhinolophus arcuatus, above, and then below is actually a fruit bat, Macroglossus minimus. And this is also recently has been found to be positive of coronavirus, and this is also found in Southeast Asia. So the transmission some of the scientific researchers have suspected that from bats, because the coronavirus has been isolated in the respiratory system from swabs. In the bats, and then it moves to the civet and then to humans. Okay. Of course, this is the coronavirus. This is again a photo of a horseshoe bat, and then the suspect for COVID-19. The source that is suspected are bats, primarily the horseshoe bats, which harbor a lot of coronaviruses, and then it moves to the mixing vessel, or maybe the bridge is the disease bridge, could be the scaly anteater or the pangolin. Okay. And this pangolin in the photo is actually one of those that were confiscated before, together with the other pangolins. This is the Palawan pangolin. Pangolins have been known to harbor also a virus that's similar to the COVID-19, 90%, more than 90% similar to COVID-19. So the mixing of the virus from the bats and the virus from the pangolin could result to a newly evolved virus that can now be transmitted to humans. And now this COVID-19 is also being transmitted from humans to humans. Some zoonotic diseases are only transmitted from animals to humans, but for COVID and SARS, there are already evidence of course, now as we know, there's human to human transmission. Okay, I've already spoken about, when I introduced some of the species that were linked to some of the zoonotic diseases. Now let me, but for obvious reasons, is the direct interaction with the species is one of the opportunities for exposure to zoonotic to zoonosis, okay, including COVID-19, and this interaction include poaching. In the photo, we see hunting, and also this one is from the selling cloud rat along the road. Okay, and this of course creates opportunities for exposure along with the hunter and with the poachers. Okay, right. So these photos also show direct contact and with the species that possibly carry diseases. No, as you can see, some of the manner of harvesting them or catching them from the wild is shown in the photos. Okay. And this, of course, creates opportunities for interaction with any viruses that may be carried by this species. So from poaching, as you can see, trade in wildlife is one of the fourth largest industries in trafficking, next to drugs, human, and weapon trafficking. And it's very high value. The worth is up to it's worth billions of dollars and hundreds of millions of plants and animals per year. The scaly anteater, of course, is also very high value these days. And if you, in the photos, you could see the conditions of illegally traded wildlife. These are they are very crowded. They are placed in very small containers, and this actually cause more viruses to be shed by these animals. Okay, and of course the traders are exposed to this, including the. All right, so once it's in the market, it's the conditions are very poor. There are interactions across species that in the natural world are not really interacting with each other, but in the illegal trade, they are closely in contact with the various species. They are placed together in one box, so they are moved to the households or to your table for food, to restaurants, and this again creates opportunity for exposure when these are utilized by the public. No, they are taken care of as pets, and this is below. One of the photos is a skinned pangolin, which is also in demand for meat and for scales. So they dress them, and sometimes the body parts are being sold separately. This is being sold at around $400 to $500 per kilo. Okay, so and if there's a demand, there's also there's a temptation to collect them from the natural habitat, and this creates exposure not just from the poacher to the trader, to you and to me if you are patronizing illegal pets and meat. Okay, other means, other ways where our humans are exposed directly to the wild species, of course, irresponsible tourism, unnecessary handling of the animals, touching them when you don't really need to do it. What we are promoting actually for biodiversity conservation is just to view them, to watch them, but minimum handling is really advised, unless really necessary for scientific purposes or for surveys. So with the species, it's obvious, there's a direct link, there's a contact if you catch them, if you poach them. But there are also pressures on the ecosystems, on their habitats, provide opportunities for the species to move closer to human habitation. Encroachment, for example, destroying habitats, encroachment below. You could see more households are being established in forest areas. And above development, land use change, that's a bat roosting area that is being developed into something else. On the other photo, this is a peatland area. It's a wetland area that is being transformed into a residential area. So these are natural wilderness being transformed into human habitation areas, or to areas that are that will trigger closer contact with wild animals. Okay. In this photo, which is you could see above, in the hanging from the trees, are fruit bats. This is Pteropus vampirus, and it's also known to harbor a lot of these viruses in their system. But rarely do they actually jump from bats to humans. They usually, for the bat viruses, they usually have to go through another species first before they jump to humans. There has not been any record so far that the viruses have jumped from the bats to humans. But getting in areas where they are now closer to human habitation will allow them to be in contact with some of the domestic species that I have informed earlier. These bats are now have actually moved. Previous to this photo, these bats were not found in this area. A few years ago, in a survey, these bats were found somewhere closer, that the roosting trees were in another area. But the roosting trees were disturbed through hunting, and eventually they moved to the center of the community. And now these are being viewed by the communities, and we are conducting more educational campaigns so that the communities will be able to take care of these roosting areas and of these bats, and to avoid less exposure, but to enjoy them in their wild state. After all, these bats as fruit eaters are actually very helpful in propagating more fruit trees, and also in pollinating and expanding some of the important trees and fruit trees, other important plants. So this is one of the projects that we are doing now to enjoin the community to help us protect the bats. Okay. This is in a marine area. Coastal and marine pollution, of course, is threatening coastal and marine habitats. Poorly planned coastal and marine development has exposed more people to be more closely in contact with the avian species. Okay, and as I mentioned, some farms and some poultry are being taken care of near watering areas of migratory species. In one of the in the next photo that you will see, these are wild bird mortalities that were found in an area near a polluted marine body. Okay, this was reported and the photos were taken and sent. However, when we returned to that area, this has already been cleaned up. So these birds were no longer found, and a further study could not be undertaken to determine the actual cause of death. And we could not have determined whether it was infectious or not. It could have been non-infectious, but nevertheless, these are indicators that there's an unhealthy environment, and that could affect public health. However, even if it's not of public health, an immediate public health concern, the reduction, the mass death of wild species that are anthropogenic in cause are also again opportunities where the species, the genetic diversity of the species decline, and eventually they will not have enough resilient genes in the population that will allow them to fight against infectious diseases. So it's important that there's a viable population of species in the wild that will allow them to keep on building up against infectious diseases. With that said, it's very unfortunate that we did not get an opportunity to test the birds or to examine, to assess the cause of death of the birds that were found in that area. It's important that all of the medical profession, all of the fields in the environment, in the health, in biodiversity, in domestic animals, vets working on livestock, vets working on wildlife, and human also doctors, human doctors, laboratory scientists, biologists. We need to be more conscious of the existence of these zoonotic diseases and how all of these are interacting with each other, that environment is related to the environmental condition, and then all of the species are all interconnected, and we need to adopt a One Health approach, especially at this time, to avoid future pandemics. It might be a little too late for COVID-19, but opportunities are there to keep on studying. The survey that we did, for example, on the bats, is composed of a multidisciplinary team. We had the biologists, and we had laboratory scientists, virus experts, we had veterinarians and medical doctors who were involved in that study. And if we are to discover the links and future potential pandemics, it's important that all these conditions are met, and we should be working together to do the study. And this is a very good time to do it and to relearn some of these studies look at the past, what factors could have affected some of these diseases, and how was it triggered. Maybe it's something in the environment and it's not within your circle of influence. So what we are recommending now is really to start working with the other sectors, and form multidisciplinary teams to be able to understand better zoonosis and to be able to prevent future pandemics. So our efforts should be integrated among the various fields in health, and also not just health, but as well as communities as well. As I have shown that we also work with the communities, because some of them, the indigenous communities, for example, some of them have some information that maybe on their culture, history, that may not be familiar to us in the medical field. So all of this needs to be an integrated effort. Okay, so this one is a photo of the bat study that we did on looking for the Ebola in bats. And of course, it was already found that one insectivorous species of bat does contain Ebola virus, was positive for PCR. However, of course, more has to be undertaken. In the fruit bats, none was found, but the samples were also limited. So cave bats were also tested. Okay. And the test, of course, it was we did not, it was capture and release. Okay, so the bats are culprits, or not culprits, but are wildlife reservoir. They are mainly identified as the natural reservoir. But as I mentioned, there has been no record of the transmission directly from bats to humans. But then their system actually contains a lot of viruses. In ASEAN, we have 346 bat species, and if you can see in the map, we have in the ASEAN, we have one of the highest diversity in bat species. Okay, in Southeast Asia. 30% of these bats are fruit eaters and nectar feeders. As I mentioned, some of them are the identified sources of viruses, and 20% are insectivores. The horseshoe bat is an insectivore, and it has been identified the wild reservoir for coronavirus. They are quite resistant. They build a lot of resistance for the viruses, because they believe because of the they fly long distances, and they are exposed to several organisms and potential exposure. They eat insects, and this actually they say that this is the reason why scientists say that this probably is the reason why the bats have a lot of viruses in their systems, and it doesn't affect them at all. Okay, the rest of the bats are feed both on small rodents and insects, and sometimes still eat fruits as well. And almost 20% of these bats are already threatened. Around 13 are endangered to critically endangered. And not only bats are endangered or threatened. A report by the Intergovernmental Panel for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. This is the expert panel. It's a panel of scientists that are experts for biodiversity and for nature and the services that it provides. Their report, which was released last year, is already they find that around 1 million animal and plant species are threatened with extinction, more than ever before in human history. So that actually has an implication, as I mentioned, because some of these viruses, that some of these species may now be looking for new hosts. Okay, and I haven't even mentioned vector-borne diseases. That is also one of the impacts of illegal wildlife trade. In the photo are the tokay lizards that, of course, feed on vectors such as mosquitoes, vectors for dengue and other mosquito-borne diseases. Okay, and a study has already shown that during the time when the collection of these animals peaked, then there was also rise in dengue cases. So in this photo, which was from Karesh in 2012, but it was also utilized in a UNEP publication on zoonosis in 2016, shows that there's usually, from wild animals, it spills over to domestic species or to humans. And of course, there are certain conditions that as I mentioned, that triggers this spill over. And those are what I have mentioned earlier in my presentation. And it is in the latest, from IPBES also, latest study, is there may be around 1.7 million unidentified viruses believed to still exist in mammals and water birds that can infect people. And so the COVID may not be the last pandemic because there are a lot of potentials that are still there in the wild, and if we create the good condition, then this would result to spill over to domestic species and even directly from wild animals to humans. Well, just to mention the loss of biodiversity that was in my previous slide, not only directly causes transmission, but the potential medicines that can come from nature is also affected. Some of a lot of the medicines now, pharmaceuticals, are coming from nature. Okay, and if we lose our species, the plants, and some of the marine species, we lose the opportunity as well to use them for treating zoonotic and other diseases. So One Health. Next, we need to have a transformational change. We need to change our mindset, change our behavior. We have to have a new development paradigm. We need to appreciate the link between our environment. We mainstream biodiversity and care for the environment in our everyday decisions. If we're working in agriculture, we look at we need to plan properly. We need to we need to make sure that it is within our. It's not just we already have to keep this in mind. It's a new development paradigm. Now that we are coming into the new normal, it's important that we have this change in mindset and in behavior. That all of these are interconnected, and when we do our development planning, we need to be able to take into account the biodiversity or the environment that surrounds us. So that's so we need that. We need to change our mindset and behavior. We need to have a new development paradigm for the new normal, and we mainstream in everything that we do. We mainstream biodiversity and environmental protection. And lastly, we need to invest in sustainable activities. We need to create incentives for environmentally sustainable, biodiversity-friendly livelihoods and industries. We need to take into account the impacts of our businesses to the environment. We need to support technologies that will reduce footprints in nature. See how we can use more renewable resources. Now, this technology actually, the one that we are using for our webinars, are opportunities to avoid lesser contact. It's a technology that helps us avoid pollution in the environment. And so if we can use some technologies and then also look at traditional practices and then provide more incentives and investments towards this, and that would be able to help us move forward in trying to prevent future pandemics, now that we see that all of these are interrelated. This is my last slide, and for those who have seen my presentations in the past, this has been my favorite quote, but okay, this time it is resonating more than ever, and it's from The Matrix. And probably I don't have to read it. If you've seen The Matrix 10 times, as I have, then it should be familiar to you, that it is actually us that now, in these days, we are now seeing that it's probably humans that are behaving like more like viruses. And this is something that we need to keep in mind, so that we will be able to improve ourselves as we are now into the new normal, and to prevent future pandemics. I think that's it.
Thank you,
Dr.
Dr.
Lim. Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Okay, so we have several questions actually. Some of them were forwarded to me via private message. But before we do that, we'd like to request the participants to please answer only 3 poll questions. So James, could you flash the 3 questions? This will be very quick. Please click on the poll button. Okay, please continue sending your questions in the chat box so that Dr. Mundita can answer it. And thank you everyone for attending this maiden episode. There are some others who are joining via YouTube, and some of the others were not able to join the Zoom call for some technical glitches, but hopefully in the next one, we will be able to accommodate more participants. Okay, so there are 3 questions here. Where is the poll button, James? But anyway, if you cannot see the poll button, you can also send your comments via chat so that we can improve on our next sessions. James, parang wala. Is anyone seeing the poll?
Yeah, it's on.
Okay. But is the poll button available? Okay. So those are the 3 questions. If you are able to answer it, that there's no poll button now. So anyway, we'll proceed with the Q&A. We have several questions actually. James, we can skip that for now. I actually saw a question from Dr. Bernard Baisik. Dr. Baisik, thank you for attending. The question, Mundita, is that medical doctors in the Philippines are not aware of the One Health initiative as vets. As much as vets, siguro. How can we push this initiative not only to our medical and allied health services counterparts, but to environmentalists as well? That's a very nice question, Dr. Baisik. Mundita, would you like to take that?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Baisik, for the question. Actually, when I was still in my previous position in the DNR and as a wildlife vet, we already had a mechanism to work with the Department of Health, and that was a start. But you are right that it's not yet as widely disseminated as much as we want it to, and I think all of us, this webinar is an opportunity to share what our experiences are, and I think this is a good. If you share this, this is a good strategy to be able to reach out to the medical profession, and each of us can actually be advocates for One Health. So in every presentation that I have that is linked to this, and even in the ASEAN, we are now working with the ASEAN health sector, no? And these are all, we always find these opportunities to share this linkage between animals, domestic animals, wild animals, human health, as well as the environment. So in every opportunity that we have, I think we should all be advocates for One Health.
Okay, thank you, Mundita. There's another question here. For COVID-19, just like for the other viruses that you had projects on, are you doing any related tests?
We're always, well, right now, I'm now with the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity, so we work with the national governments. But if we are in our projects before, and even now, if we are going to support such a project, we want to maximize the capture of the species. If we're going to study, for example, if we're going to trace certain viruses, it would be good to already, if we have the resources that are available, it would already be good to maximize the capture of the bats and also get all the information to see how this can all be, aside from just the the biological information, you can also already be able to get some samples from the saliva and from the system to be able to determine any links. So we actually encourage that the coordination be already, if we are going to support with the resources some of these studies, we of course would encourage that a lot of these tests already be done when you capture an individual, because we also we also want to reduce the stress on the individual and on the individual species and on the population. So yeah, so we if the resources are available, we will support such an integrated project.
Okay, thank you. There's a comment from Dr. Jerry Kamer. Dr. Kamer, thank you for attending. This is with regard to the question of Dr. Baisik. His comment is that for me, a policy has to be in place where interactive communication, information sharing, as well as zoonotic problem solving are put in order. This can be coordinated by both the PMA and the PVMA for the DOH and the DA to complement. So I think that's a challenge for the PVMA, Dr. Baisik, right? We're both here.
Yeah, and I think that's, yeah, and thank you. I think that's a very concrete suggestion to concretize the sharing of experience and to promote One Health.
Okay, we're 9 minutes over, but there's this very interesting question. Considering that the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity is based in the Philippines, how would you rate the status of the Philippines in terms of protecting or having a sustainable biodiversity program?
Well, I think it's we are in a very good position at the moment. The protected area law has just been passed, and as you mentioned, we start with the policy that can be that will institutionalize some of the actions. The Wildlife Act still needs to be updated, and that is already something that is being worked on. The enforcement I think, is being strengthened at this point. So that's a good sign. However, we also need to work on the social aspects, because addressing illegal wildlife trade is not just enforcement alone, but also working with the communities to address the social issues, so that, you know, to even if you enforce, but if they lack the livelihoods that will allow them to you know, to sustain their families, then sometimes they are driven to also poach, no? So we need to address uh, these issues in an integrated manner, by, you know, not just through enforcement, but also through social actions as well. That's why other sectors needs to be involved, like in implementing these actions uh, to address future pandemics. Like, you know, the DSWD should also be involved. Agriculture should also, DA should also be involved. It has to be a whole of government approach. So although a lot is already being done in the Philippines, there could be more. And of course, being based here in the Philippines, ASEAN Center for Biodiversity is always willing to support such an integrated initiative among the various sectors to promote an integrated approach in addressing future pandemics.
Okay, so in essence, it's really a change in mindset in terms of taking into account what the impact of our action is into the environment, into nature, and all that. So thank you very much, Dr. Mundita. Any parting message before we close this episode?
Well, of course, I'd like to thank Society of Men and Societas Mulierum for organizing this webinar. Thank you for also giving me the opportunity to be in this maiden episode. I'd like to thank everyone who has listened in and who has watched this session. And I hope after this you help us share this message, and also you know, I would welcome to work with you if you have plans or if you have projects that would promote all of the recommendations that I provided in the presentation. So thank you very much, and thank you, Lina, for ably moderating this session.
Thank you. So I think that wraps up our first episode of COVID-19 Veterinarian's Perspective. Thank you, Dr. Mundita Lim, for being our first speaker. So opening salvo natin, Dr. Mundita, and for sharing those insightful messages to us veterinarians. And hopefully in the future, we can have you again for a more in-depth discussion. To all our participants, thank you for joining us. And right after this, we will be flashing the next episode. So James, kindly flash that. We have a list of topics for the next few weeks. So please stand by for this. The next one is actually next week. That will be pets, vets, and COVID-19, how the virus changed the way I practice, by Dr. Raymond De Villa. And then followed by our colleague in the pharmaceutical distribution industry, as well as from a colleague who is based in Korea, Dr. Pawi Kamayo. So watch out for the announcements for the next session. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a nice evening.